The mahogany doors of the city's most prestigious bank didn't just open, they were guarded, and today, they were firmly shut against her. Elias Thorne, the man who had built an empire on the rubble of forgotten promises, didn't even look up from his ledger. To him, she was just another ghost from a town he had erased from his balance sheet decades ago. He mocked her lineage, his laughter cutting through the sterile air of the office like a jagged blade. He didn't know that tucked inside her worn leather satchel was a single piece of yellowed parchment from 1968. He thought he was closing a file, he was actually signing his own downfall. Elias Thorne was a man defined by numbers. To him, people were merely assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be liquidated. As the senior managing partner at Thorne & Associates, he spent his days in a suite that overlooked the city, a view that served as a constant reminder of his dominance. He was precise, calculating, and fundamentally devoid of empathy. When his secretary buzzed his intercom to announce that a woman claiming to be the daughter of the late Julian Vance was waiting in the lobby, Elias didn't feel a pang of recognition or remorse. He felt an annoyance, a minor glitch in his otherwise flawless daily schedule. He had known Julian Vance once, back in the late 60s, when the world was changing and the rules of the game were still being written in the smoke-filled rooms of local government. Julian had been a dreamer, a man who believed in the integrity of the soil and the value of a handshake. Elias had been the opposite. He had seen the potential for extraction, for turning those rural plots of land into industrial playgrounds that would generate wealth for generations. He had outplayed Julian, systematically stripping away the man's holdings until there was nothing left but a small, derelict homestead on the edge of the county. The door to Elias's office creaked open. Clara Vance stood in the threshold. Her presence starkly out of place amidst the polished chrome and Italian leather. She wore a coat that had seen better winters, and her eyes held a weariness that only comes from years of fighting battles that the world had already deemed lost. She wasn't here for charity, she was here for justice, a concept Elias had long ago calculated out of his risk assessment model. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She had practiced this moment in the mirror for years, refining every syllable to ensure it couldn't be dismissed as the ramblings of a desperate woman. Elias leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced over a mahogany desk that cost more than the house she had grown up in. "You have exactly 2 minutes, Ms. Vance. I'm a busy man, and quite frankly, the era of your father's relevance ended about 40 years ago. Whatever grievance you think you have, it's past the statute of limitations. It's past the point of relevance." The cruelty in his tone was calculated. He wanted her to leave, to retreat back into the obscurity from which she came. He had spent decades ensuring that the history of his acquisition of the Vance estate remained buried under layers of legal jargon and corporate acquisition filings. He had bought judges, silenced county clerks, and intimidated anyone who dared to question the legitimacy of his rise to the top. Clara didn't flinch. She took a step forward, the floorboards silent under her boots. "My father didn't lose his land in a fair trade, Elias. He didn't lose it to bad luck or market shifts. He lost it because you fabricated a debt that never existed. You took advantage of a man who was grieving the loss of his wife, and you used a forged document to seize everything he had." Elias chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that lacked any real humor. "Fabricated? That's a bold accusation to make in an office filled with legal counsel. You're talking about an era before digital records. Before the oversight we have today. You're talking about a time when land deeds were held in local county vaults that were prone to flooding, fire, and human error. You have no proof. You have nothing but stories told to you by a broken man who couldn't handle the pressures of the modern economy." He looked at his watch, a signal that the meeting was nearing its end. "You see, Clara, in this world, the person who writes the history is the person who controls the capital. I am that person. Your father was a footnote. You are a typo." Clara watched him, measuring his arrogance. She saw how he leaned into his own power, how he underestimated her because of her clothes, her background, and the fact that he viewed her as a daughter of a loser. He was so blinded by his own narrative of success that he failed to see the danger right in front of him. He thought that because he had been untouchable for 40 years, he would remain untouchable forever. She reached into her satchel. She moved slowly, giving him time to witness every detail. She pulled out an envelope, thick and weathered, the paper yellowed to the color of aged parchment. It wasn't just a document, it was a relic. "This isn't about my father's memory, Elias," she said, her voice dropping into a calm, dangerous register. "This is about a mistake you made in 1968. You were so focused on the land that you forgot about the mineral rights, and more importantly, you forgot that my father kept a carbon copy of the original agreement, an agreement that included a clause that would have triggered a reversion of the property if certain conditions weren't met within a 50-year window. We are currently at year 49, month 11, and day 28. Elias stopped smiling. For the first time, a flicker of genuine alarm crossed his face. He knew that if such a document existed, it didn't just threaten the property, it threatened the entire foundation of his current assets, which were built upon the equity derived from that specific acquisition. "That's impossible," he muttered, though his hands had stopped moving. The silence that descended upon the office was heavy, thick with the weight of decades of buried secrets finally gasping for air. Elias Thorne, a man who had not felt a tremor of uncertainty in over 4 decades, found his pulse quickening. He stared at the yellowed envelope in Clara's hand as if it were a coiled snake ready to strike. The year 1968 had been a masterclass in his own ruthlessness, a year where he had effectively liquidated the competition and paved the way for his empire. But even the most diligent architect of fraud occasionally leaves a crack in the foundation. "Let me see that," Elias commanded, his voice losing its polished edge and betraying a frantic, underlying greed. He moved to rise, but Clara pulled the envelope back, her expression hardened like flint. "No," she replied flatly. "You've seen enough of my family's legacy. You've seen enough of our lives burned for your convenience. What you're looking at is the missing half of the equation. You were so busy manipulating the public deeds, so focused on bribing the county record keepers to look the other way while you filed your fraudulent claims, that you neglected to consider the private correspondence between my father and the State Oversight Committee. My father wasn't just a farmer, he was a man who understood the machinery of the law better than you gave him credit for." Clara walked to the window, looking out over the city that Elias claimed to own. "In 1968, the year you thought you had us cornered, my father knew the end was coming. He knew the debt you claimed he owed was a fiction, a trap you had set to force him into foreclosure. But he also knew that fighting you in your courts would be a suicide mission. So, he prepared for a different kind of war. He spent his final months documenting every single interaction he had with your firm, every forged signature, every backroom deal, and every threat made against our home. He didn't just write it down, he had it notarized by a man who had no skin in the game, a man whose only loyalty was to the truth." Elias gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. He remembered the notary, or he thought he did. There had been a handful of people in that small, dying town who had witnessed the signing of those original deeds. He had systematically visited every single one of them in the years that followed, ensuring their silence through intimidation or well-placed favors. He had considered the case closed, a locked box submerged at the bottom of the ocean. "You're bluffing," Elias spat, though the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed him. A notary signature from 1968. That paper would be dust by now. Even if you had a record, it wouldn't hold up under modern scrutiny. The laws have changed. The statutes have shifted. You're trying to build a fire with damp matches." Clara turned back to face him, a faint, chilling smile playing on her lips. "That's where you're wrong, Elias. The law is the one thing you never truly respected, you only used it as a tool. But the law has a long memory. The document I hold isn't just a record of a transaction, it's an admission of liability, signed by you, when you were young, arrogant, and convinced that your rise to power was inevitable. You were so arrogant that you didn't even hide the paper trail. You left a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to your own front door." She walked back toward the desk and slowly laid the envelope down, not handing it to him, but placing it on the polished mahogany as a challenge. "My father didn't just save the paperwork," she continued, her voice now dangerously low. "He spent his final years, after we were cast out of our home, tracking your investments. He watched as you leveraged that stolen land to acquire the holdings that form the backbone of this bank. He realized that if your acquisition of that land was proven fraudulent, the entire house of cards you've built since then, every expansion, every merger, every acquisition, could be subject to a clawback provision. Everything you own, Elias, is fruit of a poisonous tree. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was no longer a confrontation between an abandoned daughter and a powerful tycoon, it was the beginning of an interrogation. Elias looked at the envelope, his mind racing through the implications. If Clara was right and if that document was authentic, the ripple effect would be catastrophic. It wouldn't just be a legal headache, it would be a complete and total liquidation of his assets. The board would oust him, the regulators would descend like vultures, and the empire he had spent his life cultivating would be dismantled piece by piece. Why wait until now, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why come to me now, 49 years later? If you had this, you could have come at any time. Clara's eyes darkened, the pain of those years briefly flashing across her features before she masked it. Because my father didn't want the money, and he didn't want the land. He wanted you to experience what it felt like to be completely powerless. He wanted to wait until you had built your empire so high that you couldn't see the ground beneath your feet. He wanted to wait until you felt entirely untouchable. He knew that the only way to truly destroy a man like you wasn't to take your pennies, but to take your pride, your reputation, and your sense of certainty. He wanted you to stand on the edge of the abyss you created, and look down. She tapped the envelope. You mocked me, Elias. You mocked the daughter of a man whose life you destroyed. You thought I was a pathetic, forgotten girl. But I am the manifestation of every promise you broke, every life you ruined, and every rule you subverted. I am the audit you never saw coming. Elias Thorne felt a genuine shiver run down his spine. He was looking at a woman who had nothing left to lose, and in his world, that was the most dangerous kind of adversary. He reached for the envelope, his hand trembling. The tension in the office was no longer just professional, it was existential. Elias Thorne, a man who had navigated the shark-infested waters of high finance for decades, felt the floor beneath him turning to quicksand. He stared at the envelope, his fingers hovering inches above it. He wanted to snatch it, to shred it, to call security and have this woman removed, but he knew that any aggressive move would only confirm his guilt. The legal trap was already sprung. If he panicked now, he would be admitting that he had something to fear. You're playing a dangerous game, Clara, Elias said, his voice regaining a semblance of his usual cold authority. Even if this document is what you claim, the world of 2026 is not the world of 1968. You think you can just waltz into my office with a piece of paper and dismantle an empire worth billions? The courts are bought and paid for by people like me. I have legal teams that make the law look like a suggestion. You'll be crushed before you even file the first motion. Clara leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk, meeting his gaze with a terrifying calmness. That's what you rely on, isn't it? The belief that justice is a commodity, something you can purchase in bulk. But you've overlooked one critical detail. The 1968 deed didn't just transfer land, it established a private trust, one that fell under a specific set of international statutes because of the mineral rights involved. My father wasn't just a farmer, he was a silent partner in a much larger venture that you tried to absorb. That trust is still active, and its oversight committee isn't located in this city. It's handled by an international board of trustees that doesn't care about your local influence or your campaign donations. Elias felt the color drain from his face. The mention of the mineral rights brought back a flood of memories he had suppressed for years. He remembered a meeting in a basement office, a quick signature on a document he thought was merely a tax loophole, and the smug satisfaction he felt when he thought he had swindled the entire region. He had completely forgotten about the trust clause because he had never intended for it to be triggered. He had been so young, so hungry, and so incredibly careless. What do you want? He asked, dropping the facade of intimidation. I want you to experience the process of unearthing, Clara replied, her voice smooth and deliberate. I want you to watch as every single transaction you've made since 1968 is audited. I want you to sit in a boardroom and listen as your board of directors learns exactly how their bank was built. I'm not here to negotiate a settlement, Elias. I'm here to witness your unraveling. She stood up and began to walk toward the door, leaving the envelope exactly where it was. It was a power move, a sign that she no longer needed the document to win. The mere existence of it was enough to infect his entire operation. Over the next few weeks, the unearthing began. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing erosion. Clara didn't go to the media, she went to the auditors. She provided the documents, one by one, to the regulatory bodies that Elias had spent decades dodging. She walked into the offices of government oversight committees with the precision of a surgeon. She knew exactly which threads to pull to unravel his tapestry of deceit. Elias tried to fight back. He reached out to his contacts, those powerful men and women who owed him favors, but they were already distancing themselves. In the high-stakes world of finance, nothing is more contagious than the scent of a sinking ship. Once the first audit showed discrepancies, once the first headline appeared questioning the origins of Thorne and Associates Foundation, the vultures began to circle. He found himself sitting in his office late at night, the lights dimmed, watching his empire fracture in real time. His stock prices were dipping, his primary investors were demanding emergency meetings, and his legal team was beginning to bill him for their departure rather than their defense. He was being squeezed from all sides. The irony was suffocating. He, the master of leverage, was now being leveraged into oblivion. He spent his days trying to track down the history of the document Clara had presented. He hired investigators to go back to that town, to talk to the descendants of the people he had intimidated all those years ago. He discovered, to his horror, that Clara hadn't been working alone. She had been building a coalition. She had spent years gathering testimonials from the families he had displaced, the small business owners he had bankrupted, and the employees he had discarded. They were all waiting for this moment. They were the silent witnesses to his rise, and now, they were the architects of his fall. Every time he looked at his phone, there was a new notification. A subpoena, a call from the board, a demand for a performance review. He was being subjected to the same ruthless tactics he had employed against others. He was being measured, liquidated, and erased from the very industry he had dominated. He realized now that he had never been the protagonist of his own story. He was just a villain in someone else's, and the final chapter had been written long before he had even achieved his first success. He had been fighting a war against a ghost, a remnant of a past he had tried to bury, but the past had a way of resurfacing, especially when it was backed by the cold, hard reality of a deed that was, by all accounts, bulletproof. He sat back in his chair, the office around him feeling smaller and colder than ever before. He was a prisoner of his own success, waiting for the inevitable hammer to fall. The day of the emergency board meeting was, by all accounts, a masterclass in professional execution. The air in the boardroom was so still it felt pressurized, as if the oxygen had been extracted to make room for the impending collapse. Elias Thorne sat at the head of the long, polished table, a seat he had occupied for 22 years. Usually, this chair felt like a throne, today, it felt like an interrogation stool. Around the table sat the board members, the titans of industry, the silent financiers, and the venture capitalists who had once treated Elias as a messiah of growth. Now, they wouldn't even meet his eyes. Clara Vance entered the room at exactly 9 a.m. She wasn't carrying a satchel anymore. She was empty-handed, walking with the quiet, devastating grace of someone who no longer needs to carry evidence because the truth has already permeated the room. She stood at the opposite end of the table, directly facing Elias. She didn't look like a victim, and she certainly didn't look like an abandoned daughter seeking closure. She looked like a creditor coming to collect a debt that had been compounding interest for half a century. "Mr. Thorne," the chairman began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We have received a series of forensic audits, as well as a collection of notarized documents from 1968 that have been verified by a third-party legal firm. They suggest that the foundation of this bank, and specifically, the initial land acquisition that leveraged our expansion, was predicated on fraudulent documentation and the systemic displacement of the Vance estate." Elias opened his mouth to protest, to dismiss it as a smear campaign or a misunderstanding of historical accounting, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the table and saw not support, but cold, clinical calculation. They were already calculating the cost of his removal. They were already drafting the press releases about corporate restructuring. "It's not just a land dispute," Clara said, her voice cutting through the tension like a razor. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. "It's a pattern of systemic fraud. Elias didn't just take the land, he used the projected mineral rights to back the initial capital for this entire bank. Every branch, every merger, every share of stock issued, and every dividend paid out was built on a false ledger. If the original acquisition is voided, the bank effectively has no legal standing for its current capital structure. She placed a single sheet of paper in front of the chairman. It was a summary, short and brutal. This is a motion for total asset freeze, backed by the international trust one mentioned. My father's agreement was never just a local deed. It was a global contract. And because it was never fulfilled, the interest on the damages, calculated at market rates over 49 years, exceeds the total net worth of Thorne and Associates. Elias felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. He had thought he could bury this. He had thought that after 50 years, the world would have moved on. But the world of high finance moves in cycles, and he had forgotten the most important rule of the game: if you build on a lie, the lie eventually demands payment. You're ruinous, Elias whispered, staring at Clara. You're destroying a machine that employs thousands. You're tearing down the economy of this entire region just to satisfy a vendetta. Clara shook her head, a flicker of genuine pity in her eyes, which, to Elias, was more insulting than pure hatred. I'm not destroying anything, Elias. You destroyed it when you decided that the value of your career was worth more than the integrity of your word. I'm just the one who finally checked the math. The board members began to murmur among themselves. Papers were shuffled, laptops were snapped shut, and the hushed tones of a firing squad filled the room. The chairman stood up, looking at Elias with a mixture of contempt and indifference. Elias, I think it's best if you vacate your seat. We need to enter into immediate negotiations with the claimant. We don't have a choice. In that moment, the power shifted permanently. The man who had mocked a young girl, who had dismissed her lineage as a typo in his ledger, was now being erased by the very system he had worshipped. He watched as the board members ignored him completely, turning their full attention to Clara. He was no longer the CEO, he was no longer a partner, he was a legal liability that needed to be mitigated. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, as if the room itself were trying to push him out. He walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. He had spent his life trying to be the most important person in the room, and yet, as he walked out, no one looked up. It was as if he had already ceased to exist. He didn't look back at the room, nor at the board, nor at Clara. He looked only at the exit sign, a glowing red beacon that signaled the end of his 40-year reign. The banker had mocked the abandoned daughter, and in doing so, he had invited the past to destroy his future. He walked out of the office, down the hallway, and out of the building, into a city he no longer recognized, and into a life where his name no longer commanded respect, only the cold, hard memory of a massive failure. The fall of Elias Thorne was not the loud, crashing crescendo one might expect from the collapse of a titan. It was a swift, surgical, and almost silent liquidation. Within 48 hours of the board meeting, his name had been scrubbed from the building's directory, his personal accounts were frozen under the terms of the discovery, and the legal teams that had once defended his empire were now busy drafting the paperwork for its dissolution. He had become a ghost in his own corporation, a phantom that the new management was desperate to exorcise. Clara Vance did not revel in the chaos. She watched it from a distance, moving through the transition with the same stoic calm she had brought into that office on the day of the confrontation. She hadn't wanted the power that Elias had wielded, she wanted the restoration of a history that had been cruelly erased. The legal proceedings that followed were extensive, but they were not a battle, they were a process of rectification. The assets that had been built upon the foundation of her family's stolen legacy were redistributed, with significant portions of the recovered wealth diverted into the community projects and historical preservation initiatives that her father had dreamed of before his life was uprooted. The town, once decimated by the loss of the Vance homestead and the subsequent industrial degradation Elias had forced upon it, began to breathe again. The land was not restored to its 1968 state, nothing ever truly returns to the way it was, but it was repurposed. The derelict sites of the industrial sprawl were cleaned, reclaimed, and transformed into spaces that honored the heritage of the region rather than exploiting it. For the people who had lived under the shadow of the Thorne Empire for decades, the sight of the heavy machinery leaving the valley felt like a physical weight being lifted. Clara spent her afternoons walking through the meadows that had once been the center of the dispute. They were quiet, peaceful, and held no trace of the bitterness that had defined her youth. She carried no satchels, no documents, and no anger. She had succeeded in her mission, but more importantly, she had found a sense of wholeness. She wasn't just the abandoned daughter anymore, she was the architect of a new beginning, a woman who had proven that the most powerful weapon against systemic corruption is an unshakable memory. Elias, conversely, retreated into a silence that was absolute. He sold his penthouse, liquidated his remaining assets to cover the mounting legal settlements, and moved to a small, coastal town where no one knew his name and no one cared about his past. He spent his days sitting on a pier, watching the tide roll in and out, a rhythmic, indifferent motion that mirrored the way he had once treated his own business interests. He was a man who had lost everything, not because he lacked the intellect to succeed, but because he lacked the humanity to endure. He had gambled on the idea that he could rewrite reality to suit his own interests, forgetting that time is a constant, and that every action leaves a mark that eventually, inevitably, catches up with the one who made it. The final irony was that even in his isolation, Elias could not escape the ghost of the 1968 deed. It appeared in his dreams, the yellowed parchment flickering in his mind like a dying flame. It was the document that had defined him, both in his rise and in his ultimate ruin. He realized, in the quiet twilight of his life, that he had never really owned anything. The land, the bank, the reputation, they were all borrowed, held in a fragile balance that he had traded for personal hubris. Clara never spoke of the confrontation, nor did she seek the spotlight of the media outlets that tried to chronicle the fall of the banker. She understood that the story was not about her victory, but about the resilience of truth. She lived a life that was quiet, purposeful, and, for the first time, entirely her own. She had taken the fragments of a broken history and used them to construct a legacy that would outlast the granite pillars of the bank that had once tried to erase her. The moral of the story was not lost on the community, nor on the historians who eventually documented the case. It served as a stark reminder that no matter how entrenched a power structure may seem, no matter how much capital is thrown at a lie, the truth remains the most volatile element in the system. It can be buried, hidden, or forgotten, but it never disappears. It waits, often in the form of a quiet, unassuming person with a single piece of paper, ready to re-emerge at the moment when the arrogance of the powerful reaches its peak. In the end, the banker had mocked the abandoned daughter, and she had responded by ensuring that he would be remembered not for his genius or his wealth, but as a cautionary tale, a man who thought he could outrun his past, only to be consumed by it. The legacy of the 1968 deed was not found in the transfer of currency or the title of land, but in the restoration of a simple, fundamental truth, that integrity is the only currency that truly holds its value over time. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a long shadow across the quiet, reclaimed fields of the Vance estate, one could almost hear the echoes of the past fading into a gentle, settling silence. The era of the banker was over, and the era of the daughter, in all its quiet, restorative power, had finally begun.